In Plato's accounts of Atlantis, his two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, where he talks about Atlantis, he dates it as 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile in Egypt, which took place roughly at 500 to 600 BC.
Okay.
So that puts it at, say, 25 to 2,600 years ago. Add that to 9,000 years, and what do you get? 11,500 for the destruction of Atlantis by a great earthquake that caused it to sink beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Coincidence?
Wow.
Yeah. No, I think that Plato was nailed. See, this is where, modern academia just dismisses the whole Atlantis account as
right. You think of Atlantis, you think of some fictional woo-woo tale.
Yeah.
And, it's only in books.
Right. But if you go back to the source, the source is Plato, the greatest metaphysician of,
right. But the big
Western civilization.
The big question is, was it a moral tale or was it a physical place? Was it a real city?
I think it could be both. Why would not an ancient commentator utilize an actual historic event
right.
upon which to graft a moral teaching?
Doesn't Plato recount in his writings that doesn't he say more than once that it was an actual real place?
Oh, yeah, multiple times. Yeah, he affirms the veracity of the account. Says this may have the appearance of myth, but it's real. It really happened. He says that, yeah. So
which brings us to the recent video of the guy who was just on Joe Rogan's podcast who talks about Jimmy.
Yeah.
Jimmy. What's the name of his channel again?
Bright Insight.
Bright Insight, yeah. So he had a conversation with Joe Rogan about the Eye of Africa being the location of Atlantis. Do you have that little video clip that I showed you earlier, Austin? Where he shows the map, Plato's map of Atlantis and where it could be and why he lays out all of his reasoning on why that could be the location.
No, I didn't know Plato had a map, so I'm not.
I could be wrong. Maybe it wasn't Plato's map. This is
somebody's
clip,
map. Though.
Let's watch this quick clip real quick.
Okay, let me.
They described an empire named Atlantis, which consisted of 10 kingdoms, and the capital of Atlantis was on an island that consisted of 3 rings of water and 2 of land, which, of course, when we look at the Rishat structure, you see that it would precisely match that specific detail of 3 rings of water and 2 of land. And not only that, it was said to open to the sea at the south, which is exactly what you see here at the Rishat. In fact, you can literally see the striations in the sand where water once flowed through it. But not only that, those white blemishes are indeed salt. An unbelievably significant detail, which I'll discuss more of in a moment. But Atlantis was also said to have mountains to the north, mountains that were said to have rivers run through them, which, yes, there are mountains with evidence of ancient water flow north of the Rishat. Atlantis was also said to be surrounded by a large plain, which also exists for hundreds of miles on both sides of the Rishat structure. Another striking similarity is that Atlantis was said to consist of black, red, and white colored stone, which is incredibly interesting when you see all the stones of that color in and around the region of the Rishat. There was also said to be an abundance of elephants, and elephants live in Mauritania today and have for thousands of years. In fact, there's an even ancient cave art depicting elephants not far from the Rishat. And Atlantis was also said to have an abundance of exotic fruit and vegetables, which makes the case for it being in North Africa even more compelling, considering that we now know that the Sahara Desert didn't even exist until somewhere around 11,600 years ago, where it went from green to desert in practically an instant. But many people are not aware of this incredible fact that the Sahara had previously been a lush green tropical paradise at the same time that Atlantis was said to exist. In fact, it was said to be made up of the largest freshwater lakes and rivers ever known to exist anywhere on Earth, which of course would support that the region of the Western Sahara would have naturally growing fruits and vegetables. But alleged vegetation that no longer exists in this region aside, Atlantis was said to have an abundance of metals, including iron, copper, and gold. Well, it turns out that Mauritania's most common exports today include iron, copper, and gold. But the similarities do not end here. You see, Atlantis was said to be created by the god Poseidon, and Poseidon had 10 children that came from 5 sets of male twins. And each of these 10 children would individually be ruler of the 10 kingdoms that made up the empire of Atlantis. And the firstborn would rule the capital, and his name was Atlas. So does anyone want to guess who the name of the first king of Mauritania was? King Atlas, who ruled over the Maori people, which is why the land is called Mauritania today. And not only that, the vast mountain region located north of the Richat just so happens to be named the Atlas Mountains. What a coincidence. Now, another incredible detail involves this map.
This is the map I was referring to.
Herodotus is considered by many to be the father of
Herodotus.
history due to his extensive historical documentation. In fact, we wouldn't even know about the Greco-Persian Wars if it wasn't for him. And some 2,500 years ago, he made a written detailed account of the known world at that time. However, he himself did not draw out this map. Others, and I do not know who or when, read through his various works and annotated that the people of Atlantis lived in this region you see here, which just so happens to be the same general location of the Richat structure. What are the odds?
All right, you can stop it there, Austin.
The very same place.
Okay, very.
So he lays out a very compelling. He sells it. He sells it.
Yeah, and generally, I like his stuff. He does a great job. We would disagree on this.
Let's go.
Well, listen, I have done an entire treatment of this. This is episode 9 of Cosmographia.
Right, which was very compelling.
And that follows upon, 6 or 7 episodes, about 10 to 12 hours.
Right.
Going into the Atlantis account of Plato, the background, all the stuff he's talking about there. And it's good stuff, man. But I have some issues with it, and I get into that. Why I believe it's not there.
I've listened to a bit of it.
Okay.
And there's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
In that.
I've read 4 or 5 different translations of Plato, and I've actually procured the original Greek, so I've been able to go in and laboriously translate the various words used. And I mean, it's clear, right at the outset, this power came forth from the Atlantic Ocean, outside the Pillars of Heracles. The Pillars of Heracles is what we call the Straits of Gibraltar. It describes that when you pass from the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean, you encounter some islands, and then you would have encountered Atlantis, and then beyond that was the great continent. So in other words, when you look at the geography, and there is like the Spartel Bank, there's a sunken island right there at the mouth that would have actually been an island that sailors could have stopped at. And then there's Madeira, possibly even other islands. That's my problem, is that Plato very clearly, to me, puts it in the Atlantic Ocean. And also very clearly describes that it sank within the ocean. So what I have done is shown throughout hours of video that there is solid evidence for post-glacial subsidence of particularly along the mid-Atlantic ridge. So all the things that Jimmy is describing there, I could show essentially the same configuration to the sunken Azores Plateau, as it's called.
Okay.
Open to the south, mountains to the north. And that's what I do in this series that I did, because I was not really familiar with the theory that the Eye of Africa was considered to be Atlantis. When I did those, I may have heard it, I had heard of it, but hadn't looked into it. So then so many people were asking about it that I did a follow-up specifically focusing on the Richat structure. And I basically go into the studies. See, I accumulated a number of studies on it in probably the early 90s, when it was still being considered an impact crater. And so when I was thoroughly reaching researching impact craters. That's when I first learned about it. And it looked to me like a multi-ringed impact structure, just like we were talking about earlier, right? Well, it later, ground-penetrating radar and analysis of the rocks and stuff showed that it was a deep-rooted volcanic feature. So it's natural. It is not human-made. It's natural. And,
Right.
and I think all the geologists that have looked at that would concur that it's natural. So the fact that it's, 1,400 feet above sea level to me is problematic, because the whole thing about Atlantis is that it sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. So, yes, there's some amazing coincidences there, as Jimmy points out. But, again, I'm going to come down on the side of if there's any reality to this thing.
Right.
My reading is, and see, people go, oh, well, Randall says Atlantis was the Azores. No, Randall doesn't say that. What Randall does say, that if you look at the 15 or 20 different locations around the world that have been proffered as being, oh, well, this is Atlantis or this is Atlantis, I think the one that fits the details of Plato's accounts almost to a T is really the Azores. And the Azores are mountain peaks, right? And those mountain peaks have their roots on it's called a microcontinent. It's about the size of Iceland, but it's sunk. And how do we know it's sunk? Well, there's numerous studies, and I get into all of that in that 10 hours or 12 hours that I've done to make the case that if there is a reality to Atlantis, and we look at all of the candidates for where Atlantis was, I think the one that comes down over and over again as being the most plausible would be the Azores. And so, but yeah, in the few minutes here that we're discussing it here, it would be, again, like I said, I did 10 or 12 hours.
Right.
This again is the old priests talking to Solon. He says, many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories. That he's talking about this proto-Athenian state that allied with the Egyptians to fight off this incursion of this great Atlantean empire, right? He says, many great and wonderful deeds are recorded in your state in our histories, but one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which unprovoked made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. And here's the key passage right here. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable. Okay? Very clear. Came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in Plato's day, the Atlantic Ocean was no different than our Atlantic Ocean today.
Right.
Now listen to this. And there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together and was the way to other islands. And from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounds the true ocean. Look back up there again.
We're looking back at the mid-Atlantic ridge.
Yes.
The Atlantic Ocean up by the...
Now, he's talking about sailing west from the Pillars of Heracles, and there were islands right there in that light gray area. So that would have been, there was an island situated in the fronts of the straits, which are called by you the Pillars of Heracles, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent. And there it is, right over there. It's almost as if he's saying these Egyptians knew about the presence of North America.
Right.
Yeah. Which surrounds the true ocean. Because as he says, for this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, which he's talking about the Mediterranean, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance. But that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent. Okay, so here we have Straits of Gibraltar.
Okay, we're looking at the Gulf of Cadiz.
Yes. Okay.
With the Africa on the bottom connecting to the Iberian Peninsula on top and the Straits of Gibraltar going right through the center.
Now roll forward one slide. Now take a look, and you'll see the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is very prominent.
Right.
Okay, and it's one of the weakest areas of crust on the entire planet.
Why is that?
Because it's a spreading center. It's where crust is being born. It's the origin of the crust. That's a huge crack there, and molten lava issues up from the crack and then spreads laterally, and it's this that's driving the motion of the tectonic plates, at least within the framework of plate tectonics. Okay, so now listen to what the priest goes on to say. Now, in this island is the word of Atlantis, there was a great and wonderful empire which had rule over the whole island and several others, and over parts of the continent. So he's very much distinguishing between the continent
and the island.
But then he's saying had rule over the whole island and several others. So it was not limited to a single island, but then and over parts of the continent. And furthermore, the men of Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt. So they would have, if that was the case, they would have been colonizing the area of northwestern Africa, what is now Morocco, what is now Libya, including probably what is now Mauritania. So if you assume that, it might have not at all been implausible to assume that, Atlantean explorers could have traversed the area of the Rechat structure, right? Then this vast power gathered into one, endeavored to subdue at a blow our country and yours and the whole region within the straits. Okay? And then, Ceylon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind, for she was first in courage and military skill and was the leader of the Hellenes. I'm going to jump for the sake of times. So then they have this big war, and led by the peoples within the Straits of Gibraltar around the Mediterranean, led by these Proto-Athenians, freely liberated all the others who dwell within the limits of Heracles. So he's describing a very explicit. You've got this power comes forth out of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. It rules over a series of islands. There's one main island, rules over the series of islands, comes within to the Mediterranean, which he describes as just a harbor compared to the real ocean, right. Subdues all of these nations, and then the Proto-Athenians manage to organize them all. They fight off, and they liberate all those others who dwell within the limits of Heracles. And then afterwards, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods. In a single night of rain, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth. So in other words, he's referring now to something that's happening in the Greek peninsula, right? And the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared and was sunk beneath the sea. Now, to me, that is pretty explicit. You got an island, there were earthquakes, it sank beneath the sea.
Right.
There's no ambiguity there.
And that part of where the Eye of Africa is, that was never completely underwater.
No, right. Not since probably Cretaceous times, because there are Cretaceous limestones
right
there, which shows that it was then underwater.
Right, okay.
Like 60 million, 70 million, 80 million years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, Jimmy is absolutely right when he talks about water flowing over. And I discussed that in my discussion of the Rechat structure, that there is evidence that there was these tremendous floods flowing over, and that's probably why the structure is exposed as it is, because these floods would have ripped away the bedrock concealing it and exposed the core of this ancient
volcanic plume.
So I mean, there's so much here we could get into.
Yeah, it's lengthy. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And anybody who finds this captivating and they want to learn more about this, I highly recommend you go to episode 9 of Randall's podcast.
Well, that's the one that specifically addresses the recap
structure. Well, there's many episodes that talk about
I
Atlantis.
think I've got 5 episodes leading up to that, 6 maybe, a couple hours each, and I go into all the geology, the geography and oceanography, like we were doing here, a line-by-line analysis of Plato's account, plus a few other peripheral accounts, Herodotus and Proclus and so on.
Right.